They say it's the most wonderful time of the year, but for a second holiday season, we will be marking another COVID Christmas, celebrating together but apart, separated from family and friends. Almost 2 years into a global pandemic, COVID fatigue is taking its toll, especially amid the surge of an unrelenting virus variant. So tonight, we turn to Dr. Simon Sherry from Dalhousie University's Department of Psychology and Neuroscience for some advice for navigating this ongoing COVID crisis. Thanks so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Well, when we last spoke, you released the findings of your study showing a major increase in people's thoughts of self-harm during the COVID-19 pandemic. What are you seeing now?
I think we're in an anxious phase of the pandemic where, yet again, there's considerable uncertainty, and that lends itself to a lot of anxiety about health and obsessive thinking. Beyond that obvious fear and anxiety, there's another meaningful subset of people who are worn out, justifiably and understandably fatigued. It's been an awfully long pandemic, and I can understand why people are feeling considerably burned out at this point.
There are real people behind the numbers that we report and that you've been studying, so how can we help?
I think at this time of year, it's very important to emphasize family connection. I certainly appreciate there are legitimate obstacles there in the middle of the pandemic with the policies most of us are trying to respect. At the same time, I would downplay the commercialized, materialistic aspects of Christmas and pay attention to the opportunity to connect with family and friends to the extent possible. It's much more important to go for a walk together or go tobogganing than it is to be out pushing in a mall to get yet another empty gift.
We've heard some shocking, even sad stories from frontline workers. COVID just seems so unrelenting, and for many careers, they just haven't had the break they need to recover. So what advice do you have for their self-care?
I think self-care is enormously important for all of us in this pandemic. In particular, we have a lot of concern about our healthcare workers. Compassion fatigue and burnout in the workplace are very real problems. And sometimes even something like vicarious trauma is an issue where people start to take on the difficulties of those suffering around them. I think it's never been more important to take breaks, to pace yourself, and to keep in mind that this pandemic is far from done. I also think it's critically important for workers to take time to go places and do things that will allow them to rest and to recover amid what is a very risky period for our healthcare workers.
How can we all combat the fatigue, even the fear?
Well, there are well-established processes by which you can combat fear. And to combat fear, you need bravery. And you want to be respectful of public health guidance. At the same time, you don't want to cower in the face of COVID-19 fear. It's important that you live your life based on your values. So if something like family connection is important to you, don't let COVID-19 back you into a corner where you're living your life based on avoidance and fear as opposed to your values and what's important to you. And from that perspective, start to push yourself to be brave and to confront situations that you're currently fearing and avoiding. And bit by bit, you can regain a sense of effectiveness in your world as opposed to being overwhelmed by fear.
It isn't just the virus people are coping with. There are other serious side effects, a rise in domestic partner violence and child abuse during the pandemic. So how do we keep people safe?
Well, I think it's vitally important to realize that there's no sense in being COVID safe and mentally ill. And that's something our government and public health professionals need to keep in mind when we mandate restrictions, when we require people to disconnect from others, to isolate and to avoid. That has major mental health impacts. And there has been a somewhat misleading narrative in this pandemic whereby we're told that stay at home and be safe. But when you look at rates of domestic violence or other problems occurring within families owing to school closures, it gives a lie to that type of statement. In fact, I think it's vitally important that we do things like keep our schools open and have our kids be safe in terms of their social and emotional development, not just safe from the virus.
There is anxiety about the variant and surging cases, but also there's frustration. How do we find hope when so many feel actually hopeless?
I understand the frustration. There are so many curtailments to our freedom right now. People get angry and they get irritable. We don't like it as North Americans when our freedom is restricted and we react with anger. We've seen examples of that over the weekend in Fredericton. At the same time, I think we have to trust in the resilience and the resourcefulness of humans. The vast majority of people will get through this pandemic and emerge unscathed in terms of their mental health. You can put a lot of trust in the strength of humans and our natural resilience. And I look forward to a time when we can once again emerge from the cave that is these restrictions and these lockdowns starting to occur around us, venture out into the world and start to connect with the people and places and activities that mean so much to our health.
There's just been so much loss in the wake of the pandemic, loss of life as we know it, job loss, losing relationships, and losing loved ones at a time when we can't mourn together. So how do we cope with the grief of loss in whatever form it's taking?
We live in a time period surrounded by grief and loss. It's a loss of every day. Sometimes it's a loss of a loved one that's been disruptive to our natural processes of grief. And I think it's important to recognize that we're all dealing with that loss. There's no particular time course or playbook for grief. I think for something like grief and loss, it's important to let your emotions have motion and to let that grief and loss play out in whatever manner it needs to in your life and between your ears.
And finally, a crisis can bring out the very best and the very worst of people. So how can we foster more caring and more compassion? We've heard Dr. Strang calling for people to be kind. We need more kindness.
I think kindness is important in this pandemic on two fronts. First of all, extending kindness to others is critically important. Realize that a sense of belonging and connection are very important protective factors. A sense of belonging and kindness and connection are gifts that you can give other people during this holiday that would be more important than anything you could pick up at Costco. Kindness extends not only to other people, it's also vitally important to have kindness toward the self as well, and realize that you have a relationship with yourself and that it's important to be kind and accepting amid this very difficult pandemic.
Thank you so much for your time and your advice this evening.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak.
That was Dr. Simon Sherry from Dalhousie University. CTV News at 6 returns right after this quick break.